Hello guys, welcome to another video. And this one, I'm going to be discussing another two new ascendancies that have been revealed for the upcoming Path of Exile 1 event, the Legacy of Phrecia. And we've received two new ascendancies. First, the Architect of Chaos, which has been renamed from the Disciple of the Trial Master. That's the one that actually won the vote. And we've also got the Servant of Arakaali as well. So, the Architect of Chaos is a Templar Ascendancy, and we're going to go over that in just a moment. And we also have the Servant of Arakaali, which is a Shadow Ascendancy. So, this one's starting in the Strength In area of the tree, and this one's going to be starting over there at the Shadow area, which is the Dexterity Intelligence part of the tree. So, let's begin then with the Servant of Arakaali. This Ascendancy is kind of minion themed. You've got some minion theming there. It's got some aspects of the spider stuff going on. And let's begin with the aspects of the spider branch over here on the left. So we have Thread Spinner, which is grants level 30 aspects of the spider. Now, level 30 aspects is something fairly new to Path of Exile 1. They were only added in patch 3.24. And these are basically slightly upgraded versions of the aspect skills, but they still reserve the same amount of mana. So they still reserve 25% mana, and that's exactly what that node's going to do there. It's going to allow you to actually reserve this skill without having it as an affix on your gear. And at level 30, it actually has 4 maximum webs instead of 3. So how this skill works is, as you sort of move towards enemies, those enemies that are nearby will slowly be debuffed over time. I believe it's 1 stack per second, and each stack makes them take 5% increased damage, and it also slows them down as well. It hinders them. So, you know, with the level 30 aspect of the spider, you're going to be able to stack up 4 of those webs on really tanky targets that you're not able to instantly kill. You're actually going to be able to stack up 4 of those, and they'll be taking 20% increased damage at max webs, which is quite a big deal, having 20% increased damage taken on the enemy, especially if you don't have any other ways to actually apply that effect, like Wither or Shock or anything like that. Increased damage taken can be quite powerful. However, one thing to say about this node is that it is an ascendancy or 2 ascendancy points spent, and I feel like this should have some kind of reservation efficiency for aspect skills or something like that on it, because you have to remember that in the late game, this can be applied to one of your suffixes on your gear to grant you level 30 aspect. It does require a beastcraft that uses the Black Morrigan, so it's not exactly cheap, but this is something that you can actually get on your gear, and once you actually have it on your gear, you know, it's then acquirable from that single gear piece, and this ascendancy node is no longer very useful. And in that sense, I'm actually a little bit disappointed that this node is one of the first nodes in the branch, and then you have to take this to be able to take these other ones. I think it would be nicer if perhaps these were 3 separate ones, or there was a different way of doing this. As it is right now, you must path through this node to get to the other nodes, which essentially buff up the power of aspects of the spider, but this does mean that you're not going to have that option to be able to replace it on your gear, unless, of course, you want to completely spec out of this entire branch and go for something else. Once you've actually specced into aspects of the spider, you then have the option to go into one of these other notables here to be able to boost up aspects of the spider. So first of all, we have Fatal Bite, and this is going to grant you 30% of physical damage as extra chaos damage while you're at maximum power charges, and also give you a 20% chance to gain a power charge on hitting an enemy that's affected by a spider's web. So this is a really, really easy way to gain power charges. Every time you're running through monsters, they're going to immediately get one of those stacks on them, and as you hit them, you're going to be constantly gaining power charges. So this is going to be a super easy way to actually get those power charges, and that means you're pretty much always going to be on maximum, and you're always going to be benefiting from this extra damage. But you kind of want to work this into a build where you can play some kind of physical damage crit build, right? So that you can then benefit from the power charges, benefit from that critical chance coming in from having power charges, and also from that extra damage there, which is extra chaos damage from your physical damage. On the other side, there's Silk Dancer, which is actually buffing up the effect of the spider's webs. So this one makes it so that when an enemy is affected by a spider's web, they will deal 15% reduced damage, and they will also have minus 15% to all of their resistances, and this includes chaos resistance, which is quite notable considering this ascendancy has quite a lot of theming going on with poison as well, not just chaos damage and physical, but also poison. So this is quite a strong debuff to have. Notice the wording here that doesn't say for each web, so this is just as long as the target has a web on them, they'll be dealing 15% reduced damage and have minus 15% to all resistances. This won't be 60% reduced damage when they have 4 webs on them, for example. It's just do they have a web on them? Yes, and then they'll have this debuff applied to them. So this is quite nice. I actually quite like the idea of taking aspects of the spider on this ascendancy early and then going for this, because it's quite a powerful early buff to grab. And perhaps later on you might consider even fully speccing out of this and maybe grabbing aspects of the spider on your gear and then going for something else on this ascendancy. And let's actually take a look at what else the ascendancy has going on. So up here we have a 2-point branch, so you just can grab this one notable and it grants level 20 Penance Mark. So Penance Mark was a skill that was added in Affliction League, and it came originally from one of the ascendancies there. And it's a mark skill that essentially applies a curse on a single enemy, and then whenever you actually hit that enemy, it will spawn phantasms, but those phantasms are enemies of you, and they're allies of the monster that you're hitting. And so it essentially creates little fodder minions that can then be interacted with, right? You can hit them to gain on-hit effects, to gain on-kill effects. They also grant flask charges and vile souls. So that's quite an important thing to note there, that you can use these to obtain flask charges and vile souls in boss fights. So that is something that you can utilize. You can actually get this mark fairly easily right now in the game, because it was re-added to the game on this unique ring here, the Hateful Accuser, which comes from Ritual. And the Hateful Accuser is actually not too bad of a ring. It grants you some cast speed, some chaos resistance, some life, and the base there itself actually has reduced effective curses on you, but it does have increased elemental ailment duration on you, so, you know, it's a kind of a trade-off there. Whether you want to actually spend your ascendancy on getting that skill, or whether you want to, you know, use this ring slot, definitely some things you could do there on the ascendancy. But again, in terms of an ascendancy point, I actually think, you know, this one here and also the aspect of the spider, not particularly strong for 2 points spent, but it's kind of what you get on these other nodes is where the benefits are. But really, the strongest part of this ascendancy is actually the minion part of the ascendancy, and also this envy node here. So let's discuss the envy node quickly first. So we have Malevolent Strands, and this node grants level 15 envy skill, and it makes it so that envy has no reservation. So envy is an aura, and it's an aura that you can only get from items. It doesn't come from a gem. There's no way of actually getting this as a gem that you can level up like normal auras like Wrath or Anger or anything like that. You can only get this from items normally. So usually it would come from something like All's Uprising, for example, with envy. That one actually makes it so the envy skill has no reservation as well. Or, for example, most recently in the 3.25 League in Settlers of Kalgur, you could actually craft this skill onto items using runesmithing. And even though this says level 1 envy skill, this is actually the same as level 15. You can actually see down here the levels, and you can see level 1 corresponds with the level 1 values here. And then you've got level 2, which is level 15 envy, and these actually provide the same amount of damage to attacks and spells. But then you have level 25 envy, and this is where the really interesting thing comes in that you can actually do with this node on the Servant of Arakaali. So you can actually gain a level 25 envy from Severed in Sleep or from United in Dream. And these are swords that come from Breach. The Severed in Sleep sword actually drops from Breach monsters inside of a Chayula Breach or from Chayula himself. And then you actually need to use Severed in Sleep combined with a blessing of Chayula to upgrade it into United in Dream if you want to use that sword. But both of these swords grant level 25 envy. And you can see that level 25 envy is a lot stronger than level 15 envy. It's just over double flat damage. So that is way, way stronger. And one really cool thing you're going to be able to do with the Servant of Arakaali is you're going to be able to spec into Malevolent Strands, and then also use Severed in Sleep. So you have level 25 envy, but it will have no reservation cost because of this line right here. Envy has no reservation. That is going to be extremely useful on this ascendancy, and that's because of this last branch over here, which is the minion branch. So first we have Skin Crawlers, which is minions have 50% chance to poison enemies on hit, and minions have 10% chance to inflict withered on hit. So you immediately have a good combination of modifiers here if you go for a poison build. There's also the 10% chance there to inflict withered on hit, which is potentially good for a hit build as well. And then coming off of this node, you have Brood Guard, which is trigger level 20 Raise Spiders on kill. Now, Raise Spiders is a skill which normally comes from Arakaali's Fang, so that's a build that uses this dagger to summon a bunch of spiders, and then you just kind of mow everything down. But the interesting thing about the Servant of Arakaali is you're going to be able to gain this skill without actually using this dagger. That's going to be important in a moment, but first let's just discuss this skill. The node from the Ascendancy says level 20 Raise Spiders, whereas the one that comes from Arakaali's Fang says level 1. This skill is going to be stronger because it can't be supported by any support gems, of course, but we don't know how much stronger it will be, so it's hard to say really how good this skill is going to be. And essentially, this is then going to be very similar to an Arakaali's Fang build, but you will not need to use the weapon, which is really important because of this second node down here, Neurotoxin. Minions have plus 5% to critical strike multiplier per withered debuff on enemy, and minions have base attack critical strike chance equal to the critical strike chance of your main hand weapon. This is really interesting at this stage because you can go for a build that is very hit-based, right? You could use Envy to make a hit-based chaos build and you just kind of go all in on the crit side of things and you deal a bunch of chaos damage. You have withered there, right? That's going to be really strong. But you could also go for a poison build. All of the options are there to do that. But you could also go for a bit of both. You have the option there to go for a poison build, and you also have the scaling to go for a crit build, a crit minion build. But it's kind of interesting, a crit ailment build. This is not really a thing that's ever been that great outside of poison crit builds on the right side of the tree. And this is something that you could do with this Ascendancy here, because whenever you deal a critical strike in Path of Exile 1, the damage doesn't actually apply directly to scale the ailment, but whenever an ailment comes from a critical strike, it will inherently have a plus 50% to damage over time multiplier, and that's actually really strong from minions specifically because minions have almost no damage over time scaling. That's also why this unique Ghastly Jewel right here that grants damage over time multiplier per Ghastly Jewel affecting you is so powerful. This one only goes up to plus 30% damage over time multiplier, and is extremely strong. It's essentially a 30% more damage multiplier for those builds because it's the only way of scaling multi on minions. Whereas if you're actually scaling critical strikes on minions and you're also going for that poison setup, you're already getting that 50% multi coming in from the crit that's inflicting that poison. So that is a potentially interesting thing you could do with this Ascendancy. And overall, I kind of think that this Ascendancy is going to be really strong, especially early on, going for a poison SRS build. I think with the first three Ascendancies, especially grabbing Malevolent Strands very early on, you can imagine taking this in your first lab and you suddenly have a level 15 MV skill with no reservation. That is going to be really strong immediately when you take it. I really like this Ascendancy a lot. I'm not 100% sold on the aspect of the Spider branch of the Ascendancy, purely because I think this node needs something a little bit more. I think it just needs some reservation efficiency or something going on there, specifically for the aspect skill. But the rest of the Ascendancy is looking really good. Now, over on the other Ascendancy, we have the Architect of Chaos, and this one is a Templar Ascendancy. And this is kind of all themed around Vaal skills and blood magic, essentially. That's kind of the two themes of this Ascendancy. Let's just get straight into it. So we have Impure Blood over here, which is... this whole branch is so interesting. This is something that we haven't seen in Path of Exile before, and it's just a really interesting thing that people are going to have a lot of fun with, I think. So Impure Blood, skills cost life instead of mana. But you'll notice, unlike blood magic, this doesn't remove your mana. It makes all of those costs transform into life costs, but your mana pool is still intact. This is a little bit of Path of Exile 2 inspiration, I think, perhaps. And then we have Hewn Flesh coming in here, which is skills reserve life instead of mana, and 100% increase life reservation efficiency of skills, but once again, no mana removal. So you're going to have your full mana pool, and that means you can kind of do some interesting things with that. You know, there's things like Mind Over Matter there, for example. You have a mana pool that you can actually utilize, but everything is costing life. Your skills are reserving life, your skills are costing life, and you have this giant chunk of increased life reservation efficiency of skills. You can combine this with the wheel on the passive tree for even more of that, and the mastery as well. Now, one of the nodes that is really interesting, which is kind of typically a life stacking thing, is Dissolution, because this is literally Dissolution of the Flesh, only the 30% more life modifier is gone, and the modifier that kind of restores your life or removes the reservation is way better. So Dissolution removes all energy shield, and life that would be lost by taking damage is instead reserved until you take no damage to life for 1 second. Now on Dissolution this is usually 2 seconds, and buying 2 seconds compared to buying 1 second for that life to then become unreserved, that is such a huge difference. You only need to find a second where you don't take damage, and suddenly all of the reservation from damage is gone. For those of you who are not aware of how Dissolution works, your recovery and things like that don't really matter. You just have your life pool, and whenever you take damage, any life that would be lost from taking that damage is reserved. And then after this period of time is gone, it's then unreserved, right? And even if your life is kind of recovering, it doesn't matter because you always begin reserving from your maximum life downwards. So even if you have 100 life out of 6,000, as long as you haven't got any of that reserved, you will begin reserving right at the top again. And that works for all damage, not just hits, but damage over time as well. So this having a 1 second cooldown, essentially, on the reservation timer there, that is going to be super interesting to play around with. And it kind of opens up the Dissolution idea to a non-life stacking build. You know, usually you use Dissolution of the Flesh in a life stacking build because it's so useful in that concept, since it provides so much life, rolls up to 30% more life. And we've actually seen Dissolution being used fairly recently. Palstron used it in his Ward build just in this previous league in 3.25, and that was actually a really good use of it there. So perhaps we could see this node being used in non-life stacking builds. That would be really interesting. I do think Dissolution is an interesting concept. It's just a very awkward item to play around with kind of normal Path of Exile gameplay, and it's one of those things that is going to be massively improved with a lower restoration time. Next up we have Forbidden Secrets, which is Everlasting Sacrifice and Shepherd of Souls. These are two keystone-like modifiers. They're not actually keystones, they're only obtained from items normally. And let's actually take a look at exactly what those two do. So Everlasting Sacrifice is this, keystone-like modifier. It usually comes from Mahazotul's Machination, which is an item that grants you this full list of keystones, and they all kind of interact with each other. I actually made a very long video on that before where I discussed about how this item works. But the kind of payoff of using that item is this keystone right here, because this is the only way you can actually get that keystone normally. So Everlasting Sacrifice, when you reach full energy shield, you sacrifice all of your energy shield to gain plus 5% to all maximum resistances for 4 seconds. But without all of those other keystones involved, this keystone is extremely strong on its own, and you're going to be able to get it almost on its own. Shepherd of Souls doesn't really interact with this, so this is just a standalone keystone pretty much, and whatever way you use to be able to restore your energy shield to full, every time it gets to full, it's then going to immediately deplete down to 0, and then for 4 seconds you get plus 5% to all maximum resistances. So you don't want to be clicking this skill if you intend to use your energy shield as a defensive mechanic, because every time it hits full, it's going to fall back down to 0 again, and you have to recharge it, or regen it, or however, leech it back to full. But you can use all of those methods to get your energy shield to full to basically maintain this buff permanently. Whether you're using leech, or regen, or recharge, or any of these ways, right, even like life flasks in combination with modifiers that allow your life flask to apply to your energy shield, you can then make it so that you have this buff permanently, which is pretty strong. Plus 5 to all maximum resistances is quite a strong buff to have with permanent uptime. The other node is Shepherd of Souls, which once again is another keystone-like modifier, which only comes from Yao-Max Accord, which is a scepter that drops from the Trial Master. So this scepter on its own, not particularly strong, but perhaps this keystone will find use as a modifier on an Ascendancy. Vaal non-aura skills have 80% less soul cost, and Vaal non-aura skills have 100% increased soul cost per Vaal skill used in the past 8 seconds. Now, I did a whole video on Yalmag's Accord where I discussed this keystone in detail, but this is a really interesting keystone. It allows you to use Vile skills very cheaply as long as you haven't used that many of them in the last 8 seconds, but if you're really spamming them, it kind of starts to be a downside after you've spammed too many of them in the last 8 seconds. So for example, if you have a Vile skill that costs 50 souls, the first use is going to cost 10 because of that 80% less soul cost modifier. But then the second use within 8 seconds is going to cost you 20 because that 100% increased cost starts to come in. Then the third one is going to cost you 30 within the last 8 seconds. And eventually, if you use too many of them, it's going to cost you more than what it would have without this keystone. So you kind of want to strike a balance there where you're using the right amount so that you're benefiting from this keystone, but not too many so that it becomes a hindrance. Now that may play into the other modifiers here, which are all to do with Vile skills. So we have this branch here that comes off. It's a 3-point branch, but you can enter it from 2 points from the beginning, and then you get to this top point up here. So first of all, we have Fever for Corruption, which is 50% increased Vile skill effect duration, and Vile skills require 50% reduced souls per use. Okay, so this 50% reduced souls per use is very, very powerful. That kind of combines with the Shepherd of Souls, and how that's going to work is that because it's a reduced soul cost, it's going to be additive with this increased soul cost. So taking the example from earlier, if you have the Shepherd of Souls keystone and you also have Fever for Corruption, that 50 soul cost skill is going to cost only 5 souls for the first use, then it's going to cost 15 souls for the second use within 8 seconds, and then 25 souls for the third use in 8 seconds, and so on and so on. So that 50% reduced soul cost is additive with this 100% increased soul cost. So it's not a huge difference that it's making, but it's kind of impactful in those first few uses there because it's significantly lowering the amount of souls you're actually using. Now, one of the really interesting things to point out at this stage here with this ascendancy is an item, Triumvirate Authority, which is a ring that drops from Aziri. You can get one that drops from the normal Aziri that has 3 modifiers, and this one that has 4 random modifiers. This one drops from Uber Aziri. So this has a collection of randomly assigned modifiers from this list, and they're all to do with Vile skills. So this is an unset ring, it has 1 socket, so you put your gem in there, you put your Vile gem in there, it gains +2 to levels, and then you can actually get a bunch of other modifiers here that affect that skill. So some of the notable ones, for example, 150% more damage with Vile skills, which is pretty good. That means you can use this as your main damage skill if you're able to spam that skill. And there's also 50% increased aura effect. That's pretty good for the Vile skill auras. But 2 of the most notable things that are on here is this one right here. Socketed Vile skills require 30% less souls per use. And this one right here. Socketed Vile skills have 30% reduced soul gain prevention duration. So first of all, let's just discuss that 30% less souls per use. That is really nice in combination with all of this stuff, because once again, it's a multiplier to that soul cost. It's going to lower down the amount of souls you're spending per Vile skill use, and you could consider using that even without Shepherd of Souls. Maybe you just combine this in. Perhaps you actually use this full branch here and use Triumvirate Authority, and then you can actually make use of Vile skills as your main ability, perhaps. But then we have the 30% reduced soul gain prevention duration. Now over on this side, we have Depose Order, which is 50% reduced soul gain prevention duration and 286% increased Vile skill critical strike chance. Not sure why that's 286%, but there we go. 50% reduced soul gain prevention duration is the more important stat on this node right here, and that is additive with that modifier from the ring. So those 2 together are going to bring the soul gain prevention duration for the skill that's socketed in this ring down by 80%. But once you have a low soul gain prevention duration and you have a low Vile skill cost, what about actually gaining those souls? Well, one thing that you could consider doing is Hateforge. These are kind of a rare drop, I think, from Trialmaster. It might even be the rarest drop that comes from that. And if you're using a Vile attack skill as your main skill, so for example, Vile Lightning Strike or something like that, well, this makes it cost Rage instead of souls. So instead of actually spending souls on those Vile skills, you'll spend rage, and with that you could consider using Chainbreaker, which is a timeless keystone. Makes it so that the mana recovery from regeneration that you have is not applied to you, but you instead regenerate rage based on that mana recovery, 1 rage regenerated for every 25 mana regeneration per second. And it also adds a downside there of making skills cost +3 rage. But this is a way to regenerate rage, and then once you have rage, you can use that rage to spend it on Vile attack skills instead of spending souls, and that means that you can spam skills such as Vile Lightning Strike. Chaos Reigns, which is +3 to level of all Vile skill gems. That is really, really powerful. Anything that gains a lot of power from gem levels is going to be really strong with that, which is pretty much anything with flat damage. A lot of those spells are extremely strong with gem levels. Something like Vile Smite is very, very powerful. The aura is going to be buffed up a lot by those 3 gem levels. And one thing that is really important to mention about this node here is that it doesn't just apply those levels to the Vile version of a skill, it also applies the levels to the normal version of that skill as long as it has a Vile skill attached to it. So for example, if you have Vile Grace, then it's going to gain +3 levels to Vile Grace, but also the normal Grace skill that's attached to that skill gem will also gain +3 gem levels. So that is a really powerful way to be able to boost another skill that you're using as well, like a normal skill, just because it's a Vile skill. Now the last node on this tree is Glimpse Chaos, and this will make you have 8% increased maximum life for each corrupted item equipped, 12% increased maximum energy shield for each corrupted item equipped, and -4 to all resistances for each corrupted item equipped. So, pretty brutal downside there. It's all resistances as well, so this is going to include Chaos Res. So you're going to take on a lot of minus res there if you stack up a bunch of corrupted items. But one thing to mention here is actually kind of the concept of these modifiers here, or where the inspiration came from, well, it's Shadow Stitch. This is almost identical to this body armor here, and this is a body armor that you get from corrupting a sacrificial garb. And because this item is corrupted, you could consider actually stacking this up with that node there to be able to gain a bunch of increased maximum life and energy shield. This is 8% ES and 6% life, so you're going to gain 20% increased maximum energy shield there and 14% increased maximum life for each corrupted item by stacking those 2 up. But you need to be really careful there. You need to make sure you can actually overcome those negative resistances. Now overall, I really like these ascendancies so far. I think both the Architect of Chaos and the Servant of Arakaali are really interesting ascendancies, and we only have 4 of 19, so we have a lot to go, and I'm not exactly sure when this event's even going to be happening yet. We've heard nothing of that just yet from GGG, but I assume it's going to be towards the end of February. But I'm really excited to see the rest of these ascendancies. What do you guys think of these 2 ascendancies? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.